Megillat Esther, the scroll of Esther, famously begins, "Vayehi b'yamei Hashverosh, hu Ahashverosh hamolech mehodu ve'ad Kush, sheva ve'esrim u'mea medina." And it came to pass in the days of Ahashverosh, this is the Ahashverosh who reigned from Hodu to Kush over 127 provinces. The number 127 might seem a little arbitrary, although people may remember it's also the number of years that Sarai Menu, the wife of Abraham, lives, and one could discuss that connection another time. But it's also actually quite a striking and interesting number from a certain perspective, which is maybe best first expressed by thinking about how you would write it in binary code, right? Where instead of using decimal enumeration, you try to write the number down in terms of the sums of powers of the number 2. And in that case, what you would find is that it's 7 ones, right? It's 1 plus 2 plus 4 plus 8 plus 16 plus 32 plus 64. And that adds up to 127, which makes sense because the next power of 2 would be 128. And so if you were going to write 128 in binary, then you would zero out all of the lower powers and just write a 1. So 1 and 7 zeros. But instead we have 7 ones. And first of all, there's something very evocative of that representation of the number, because 7 obviously reminds us immediately of the work of creation. And 7 ones, there's this sense of identity and completeness across a whole range of 7 identical things. And so there is an evocation of the wholeness or the completeness of creation, which is actually not unrelated to important ways of reading Megillat Esther, where we talk about it as though it's an allegory for how the whole work of creation works, where the idea of Achashverosh as Chazal would put it, the cosmic cractor, the sort of ruler of everything who controls all of nature. Right? And allegorically, there are things you can do with that. But I'm more interested actually for this discussion in 127 as the summation of powers of 2, because I think what it's pointing out to us is something also that is important for us to learn from Megillat Esther about political order. And that is that there is something integral and whole about well-functioning political order that is not, as we sometimes might imagine, some kind of caricature of a situation where a whole bunch of people who have no power and have no choice wait for the king or the dictator to tell them what they do, what they're supposed to do, and then they have to do it because the king or the dictator told them, but they're not free and they don't have a choice. Like in the world of modern Western liberal democracies, we sometimes get told this kind of fairy tale for children about how there are democracies where people get to actually rule themselves and be free and decide what they want their government to do. And then there are dictatorships and monarchies where people don't have that choice and don't have that freedom, and they just have to do what they're told because they, have the bad luck of living under the rule of a despotic dictator. The reason I think that that's a problematic way of looking at things is that it sweeps under the rug the basis for political power of a leader who maybe isn't a democratic leader, right? And it creates this kind of fantasy story we can tell ourselves where people are not responsible for what their government or their country does unless they live in a democracy. And honestly, people these days are often trying to say, even when we have something that approximates a functioning democracy, we still don't want to actually hold anyone accountable for what their leaders of their government does or will do. But in any case, if we're talking about dictatorship and monarchy and things like that, The story is always much more complicated when we're talking about accountability, because the truth is individual people never are more powerful than they are made by the groups of people who give them power by agreeing to do what they say and agreeing to dance according to their tune. And that's true even if you don't have a democratic system or system that functions based on elections and representatives who in principle can be dethroned by losing an election, etc. So why do I think that the Megillah is getting at this point? Well, if we talk about the number of Medinot, the number of states, in this way where we say it's 127, which means that there's 1 plus 2 plus 4 plus 8 plus 16, etc. of them, then it reminds you that we could be talking kind of in terms of hierarchical organization, right? Where it's not the case that we're just counting countries and we put all the beans in the bucket and it turned out there were 127 of them. It's more like that there are different scales of organization in which we can consider the same empire. So we look at the empire from Hodu to Kush, from India to Ethiopia, or however you want to translate those terms. And we say, okay, there's one level at which there's one thing, right? There's the whole empire. And then we could say maybe there's the Eastern Empire and the Western Empire, or the Northern Empire and the Southern Empire, or however we want to divide it. But we could kind of divide it into twos and say that at some level it's administrated or it's ruled in a way that somehow reflects differences across some kind of maybe geographic or other sort of boundary. And then you could say, okay, well, you can keep subdividing. Maybe at some other level, it's also administrated and ruled in smaller chunks, of which there are 4. And then you could say smaller chunks, of which there are 8, etc., and go all the way up to, and there are 64, at this level of division. And then the text is adding all of these different levels of organization together just to kind of remind you of how complex this is and how many different pieces there are depending on how you slice it. That actually is something that Chazal get at in their own way when they make their homiletic comment that the number of mitzvot in the Torah, which is traditionally related to be 613, divides into 365 mitzvot for the days of the year and 248 mitzvot for the limbs of the body or the bones of the body, or however you want to translate that. Now, of course, 248 as the number of appendages or limbs or bones or pieces of the body, you could wonder whether that number was just 613 minus 365, except that 248 is actually quite an evocative number with respect to what we've already been talking about, because again, it's about doubling, right? 2, then 4, then 8. It's about this notion of I can take 2 things and I can split them up, and then I have 4, and then I can split them up again, and then I have 8 things. And indeed, that is a proper way of thinking about how to understand the organization of the body, that the number of parts of the body is obviously dependent on how you subdivide it and how fine a scale of coarse graining you're looking at things at. It has 2 halves, or it could have a billion parts, depending on how finely you're separating things into their constituent parts. And to the degree that that's the case, you might say that the 127 states or countries or provinces of the empire of Ahasuerus are trying to get at something similar, that this is one body, one integral whole that has different levels of administration and organization. And that might seem like a abstruse or technical point, but I think it becomes a quite significant one when you now talk about how the plot of Megillat Esther plays out, and we end up facing the question of how Ahasuerus's power works and what he really has the power to do. Like at one level, he's this god king who rules over everyone and everything, and he has tremendous power, seemingly. And he does have the power to decide, for example, to say, let's kill all the Jews, and to make a decree because Haman provokes him to do that. And at another level, we find later that when Esther comes and says, oh, well, you have decreed against my people, can you please change that? He doesn't simply say, oh, yeah, I'm really powerful, I can do whatever I want. So I'll say, yesterday I said one thing and the other, and today I'll say the opposite, and I can do that whimsically and it doesn't matter. Instead, he acts very cannily in this constrained way where he says, well, I've already written a decree against the Jews, but what I can do is send out a decree telling them that they can defend themselves. And so he is trying to side with Esther without contradicting his previous writ. And that's showing at some level that really, although he's the ruler, he's also ruled by the mechanisms of power that allow him to have power within the system that he's a part of. And that ends up placing constraints on how he chooses to express his will that have real consequences for how the story plays out. So zooming things back out, more generally, I think what we have to learn from this is to be reminded that there's really no such thing as an all-powerful king who can simply have his way and do what he wants. There are different kinds of political order, and they may emphasize the force of the decrees of certain individuals more so or less so. You can concentrate executive power more in certain hands, or you can spread it around, and it's not like all political systems are identical. But at another level, Ahasuerus's empire is this hierarchically organized organic whole that has a whole structure of administration that we hear about in detail, with all of the messages being copied by scribes and sent around on, with messengers, and seeing how things have to operate in order for it all to work. And to the degree that that's the case, we shouldn't think of this decision to destroy the Jews as something that comes from one man or two men, perhaps from Ahasuerus and Haman, and that there's no kind of accountability or responsibility for what happens that lies in the hands of anyone else. The whole body is the thing that actually is working in concert to perform the will of the head or the heart, or however you want to conceive of what Ahasuerus is. And it doesn't make sense with an individual person to say, well, I can't hold his arm responsible for the fact that he's trying to kill me because it was just his brain that decided to kill me. And, it's not the arm's fault. So how can I possibly, chop off the arm or whatever I need to do to stop the arm from trying to kill me? That would be an nonsensical way to reason about an individual person who's going after you. And one of the things that the Megillah is reminding us is that it's the integral whole of the Persian Empire that ends up actually resolving to attempt to destroy the Jews. Even if it's the case that the sort of primary signals setting that in motion were coming from Ahasuerus and Haman, there are conceivable circumstances in which that wouldn't have taken, that wouldn't really have been possible to get the system to try to implement that kind of a decree if it were the wrong decree. And we see that roundly at the beginning of Megillat Esther because of all the careful consideration that goes into the question of how should we handle Vashti's rebellion and whether or not the king can let this stand without making some kind of statement that demonstrates properly, to the empire as a whole, what the proper relationship between a man and his wife should be, and how that's related to the political order, etc., and the languages people speak in their homes, right? What we are shown in that vignette is that the integrity of the political system as a whole actually involves a delicate back and forth that goes all the way down to the granular level of individual households of citizens and back up to this God King who supposedly has all of this power. And he is beholden to them and is treading carefully in how he sends messages to them, despite the fact that in principle, he's tremendously powerful and they are supposed to fear him and he not them. Any king who has tremendous power and is shrewd and understands where that power comes from actually lives in as much fear of his people as his people live in fear of him. And that's true even if we're talking about what we call despotic dictatorship or situations where we usually talk about the people as not being free. Now, why is this important for the present day? Well, it's important for all sorts of discussions that we could have in the present day about politics. We're in a war right now with people who attacked us from Gaza, who are not simply a completely uninvolved, uninterested herd of sheltering innocents who somehow have fallen under the despotic boot of some tiny number of rulers who may themselves be wicked, but who are using their wickedness to dominate and rule people who want nothing to do with what's going on. That obviously is the story that Americans and Europeans want to tell. It's the story that even to some degree, our government participates in validating. But there's no such thing as a political process that works that way when a whole bunch of people stand to experience tremendous hardship as a result of decisions made by their leaders about things like, carrying out a sneak attack that starts a war. They have different choices that they can make all along the way in how they either collude with and support and consent to what's happening or resist it and rebel. And you see those kinds of differences even when you make comparison, for example, between people in Gaza on the one hand and people in Iran on the other hand. Now, I think there is a tendency to exaggerate the degree to which no one in Iran likes the government there. Obviously, for the same reasons that we've been saying, lots of people in the government in Iran have to like the government in Iran because otherwise the government in Iran wouldn't be powerful and it wouldn't be able to stand for as long as it has. So people who imagine that somehow all the people in Iran hate the government and want to overthrow it, and it's just, a dozen lunatic mullahs and their IRGC commanders, and everyone else is suffering under their despotism, they're in for a rude awakening if they assume that, because it must be the case that actually a much more substantial population exists in Iran that consents to and supports the rule of the regime, because there's no way a regime can be that powerful and that successful and stand for as long as it has with no consent and no support and no participation for the reasons we've already been saying. Every functioning political leadership is an integral whole of a body that has all the different parts of a body that need to function together in order for this political entity to act with enough coherence to sustain itself. But it's also true that at least in places like Iran, you do have lots of people who go out in the streets and get killed by the army and by the government because they don't like the government and they are opposed to a lot of the things about it. So there is an incoherence to that body politic, and it does lead to a lot of internal strife and violence. And by comparison, we don't see that from Arabs in Gaza, and we haven't seen that, by and large, from Arabs in Gaza over the last 20 years. You have internecine fighting between the PLO and Hamas and things like that. And obviously, there are people who maybe would say different things or act differently if they weren't afraid that some, arm of the regime was going to come and crush them. However, no matter how brutal and no matter how unrestrained a regime is willing to be in trying to crush people who are opposed to it, the numbers just don't add up if everyone is against them, except for a bunch of guys sitting around a table in one room who keep on shouting orders out the window to go crush this person and go crush that person. It has to be the case if they can stay in power for as long as they have, they actually have a whole bunch of willing participants who are accepting enough of the arrangements of the circumstances where they have rocket launchers in their homes and they have weapons caches being hid under their children's beds and everything else that we hear about, that they're accepting enough of that and even maybe eagerly participating in it in some cases, that it can continue to go on. Because if it's the case that you can get mobs of people to run around and attack aid shipments and act with complete lawlessness like ravening mobs when it comes to matters of, whether they can get their hands on some food that they want, at a certain point, a certain kind of polity would say, well, it's true I don't want to be crushed, but I also am so outraged by the danger that this regime is posing to my children that I have no choice but to risk my life and even risk the life of my children in order to tear them down. The truth is, people and mobs make all sorts of decisions like that all the time, and that does lead to the collapse of unstable political orders. That hasn't been what's happened when it comes to the leadership in Gaza, and that's because clearly it is the case that the general public in Gaza, broadly speaking, has been supportive enough of what Hamas has been doing for the last 2 decades, that Hamas has been able to stay in power. And that brings us back to Megillat Esther and how Megillat Esther ends. It ends with a decisive blow being struck against all the people in the Persian Empire who had designed to wipe out the Jewish people. And when we look at that, and we look at it through the lens of the upside down, distorted glasses of fantasy politics for children that gets taught in America and in Europe and in the West in general now, where we say, oh, well, the only people who are responsible here are Haman and Ahasuerus and maybe his sons, but how wrong it is and how terrible it is that all of these thousands of other people in the Persian Empire are being struck by the Jews rather than what Haman had planned. That understanding mistakes the nature of politics. It mistakes the nature of how power gets deployed in political systems, whether they're democratic or not. And it ties the hands of righteous people, not just in defending themselves, but in dealing justice to countries and societies that have collectively resolved to make war against them and to try to destroy them. And that is also the situation that we now face in the modern state of Israel with respect to our enemies on any border that you can pick. It is not just the case that a tiny number of scheming, despotic, evil men in a room are the only ones responsible and everyone else is a completely innocent and uninvolved bystander. There is no such thing as a polity that can wage successful warfare against us that operates that way. Rather, it is clearly the case that whether we're talking about in Gaza, whether we're talking about in Lebanon, whether we're talking about in Iran, that you have massive popular support for the political elements within those societies that are hell-bent on the destruction of the Jewish people and in the Jewish state. And what that means is that the only just way of dealing with that situation requires not just it's practically going to find it necessary, but requires, even as a matter of justice and what's right, it requires us dealing with them not as individuals to be sifted like one grain at a time, but as an integral whole and as a body politic that has to be dealt a blow that crushes that body politic's will to continue to function and thrive in the way that it has. And the only way to do that is to hold the society as a whole collectively responsible and to wage war accordingly in a way that doesn't attempt to discriminate only at the level of individuals, as though we're looking at these people one person at a time to see who has or hasn't been guilty of some parking infraction.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement. Please email us at office@machonshilo.org.